Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're going to be watching a bit of a video. Who were the Philistines? So I'm going to be reacting to this video, and I'm going to be stopping commenting here and there, but let's take a look. Mentioned throughout the Hebrew Bible as terrifying fighters, the Philistines were ancient Israel's greatest enemy. Or were they? Decades of excavation at Tel Esafi, biblical Gath, largest, most powerful of the Philistine cities, have shed dramatic new light on this infamous biblical people. Bar's Biblical Archaeology Review assistant editor Nathan Steinmeier caught up with Aaron Mayer, director of the Tel Gath excavation, to dig deeper into the Philistines, where they came from, what made their culture so distinctive. Join us on site for this in-depth interview and learn how the Philistines first came to Canaan, how they relate to the famous sea peoples, and why they finally disappeared. So let's take a look at this video, shall we?
We're here today at the site of Tel Esafi, biblical Gath of the Philistines, with Dr. Aaron Mayer, who's actually excavated here for about a quarter of a century, correct?
Even more, close to 30 years.
A long time. So anyways, we're here today to talk about your recent article that's coming out in Bar on the Philistines.
Good intro.
Okay. Now that we got that out of the way, let's dig into the Philistines a little bit more. So, before we start on your kind of view of the Philistines, can you give me a little bit of an idea of what is the traditional view of the Philistines?
Okay, around 1200 BC, that's the transition between the Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age. It's a much longer process that's for even 200 years, but let's say 1200 is sort of a good point. And there's a big transition in the entire Eastern and even Central Mediterranean from the Late Bronze Age world order into what slowly becomes the Iron Age world order. This includes the collapse of the Mycenaean palace, political entities, the collapse of the Hittite Empire, the slow.
Yeah, so I want to comment that when the Israelites came into the Promised Land, a lot of stuff was going on in the world at that time. A lot of civilizations were just collapsing. Around the story of Troy took place around this time because there's just a lot of upheaval.
Weakening of the Egyptian Empire, and they're losing control of Canaan. And it also includes the arrival in the Eastern Mediterranean of all kinds of new groups. Best known, perhaps, are the Israelites, who appear about then, the Arameans, the Ammonites, the Edomites, etc., and also the Philistines and what we call in modern terminology, the Sea Peoples. And in the past, for example, when I was an archaeology student,
yeah, they have found mentions the Philistines in Egyptian inscriptions.
It was explained that the Philistines are basically groups, or a group, who migrated from more or less the region of Mycenaean Greece to the southern Levant, captured the coastal plain, the southern coastal plain, what we call in biblical geography Philistia, which would be in modern terms between the Yarkon River and the Gaza Strip along the coast.
Yeah, so all this would have been Canaanite. The Israelites would have crossed over, taken the hill country. The Philistines would have taken the southern country, and there is lots of evidence of the previous population being integrated in. So, for example, if you read the account of Joshua and Judges, there's a big altar to God built on Mount Ebal, right around here, but there's no mention of Shechem itself being taken over explicitly, even though it's a major site. It's probably one of the biggest. So why would Jericho down here be mentioned as being taken, but no talk of Shechem being taken over? There's evidence that a lot of like the Gibeonites who lived around here, just outside of Jerusalem, a lot of people, a lot of Canaanites just accepted the Israelite invaders, became subject people, and essentially became assimilated into Israelite culture. And the same thing happened in Gath. There would have been a core group came from Mycenae in Europe. But essentially they married their women, which does suggest a lot more conquest. There was a lot more, there was mingling on both sides. There's no denying that.
Coast, and they conquered the Canaanite cities and settled with a new non-local material culture, which over the Iron Age, over a period of some 600 years, slowly became more and more like the local population.
Yeah, I've heard the Philistines were big time in assimilating themselves. They became kind of like Canaanites, but they did know that they came from elsewhere.
Local cultures. Now, one of the things that's come out, both from the excavations at Tel Asafi and from excavations that have been conducted in Philistia and in adjoining areas over the last few decades, is that the picture is more complicated than that. And that even though there is no doubt that some parts of the Philistines were in fact from the Aegean, there's other components as well. And we see that it's not that when the Philistine culture appears, it's a 100% transferal of what they had in culture in the Mycenaean region and they brought it here. Mm-hmm. But there are some Mycenaean stuff and Cypriot stuff and Anatolian stuff and other areas. But even more importantly, there's also the continuation of some local aspects. So what I like to think now, when I think more and more scholars are looking in this direction, is that
yeah, like that's something I think is really worth mentioning. None of this is surprising, and none of this should be a huge shock to anyone in the least. For one thing, the Bible, at least in the case of the Israelites, does mention that there's a lot of intermingling with the Israelites with the Canaanites. That should not surprise anyone. There's also mentions so it is not surprising this happened with other cultures as well. Even in the Mycenaean Greeks, think in Greek mythology, a lot of the Greek myths say the founding of Thebes as coming from the Phoenicians. That is not to say that the Bible is wrong, that no one came from the Aegean. There was that core group that came over. But there were other people who joined them later on. I think of it like the United States that became a melting pot, how not everyone who is running for office or holding office in the United States lives in or is from or has DNA from the members, the people of the original 13 colonies. And it's not pure DNA. Or it might not have any DNA from that area at all. But they're still American. It's a similar idea both with the Philistines and in Israelites. Like, you're not going to find pure 100% pure Aegean DNA with the Philistines. You're not going to find 100% pure Chaldean DNA among the Israelites from the time of Abraham, for example.
The Philistine culture is basically not even a Greek salad, but a Mediterranean salad. And it's all kinds of people who came together. Perhaps might be that the Aegean component were maybe the elites. That could be, but that's not even sure. But when they come, all these different groups come together, this is what forms the Philistine culture. And this is the identity that, if you talk about in the biblical text and in other texts, when they talk about Philistines, it's probably not someone who came from, but it's the people here who formed into some group with this identity.
Okay. And you mentioned other texts, so let's quickly detour into that. I know in the Egyptian material, when they talk about the sea people, they have like the Paliset, who are traditionally viewed as the proto-Philistines.
Yeah,
is that still a theory that's tenable, or?
Well, there are a few Egyptian texts which mention various groups who, in modern terminology, we call the Sea Peoples. That's not an Egyptian term. And among them is, particularly in the reliefs of the pharaoh Ramses III in the beginning of the 12th century BCE, when he describes his battle against these groups, one of the groups is the Egyptians write Periset, which is something of the sort, because they didn't have an L, and it's accepted that that's a rendition of Peliset Philistine.
Okay.
So that probably is one of the groups that's mentioned, and that is maybe that's either directly the Philistines already, or maybe one of the components that eventually becomes what we call the Philistines. But I think that identity is quite clear, and there are other groups as well, the Chardonu and the Jekers and others, which we have a little harder time identifying. But material.
Yeah, that's like a common thing, like with Sea Peoples. Like, another word you get is like Habiru, which people think just means Hebrew. It's not. That being said, the Hebrews would have been Habiru. They would have been like nomadic desert raiders who came in. They may not have been the only ones. So, for example, other potential Habiru groups were coming to Canaan from the desert would have been potential like Moabites, Edomites, Amalek, a whole bunch of other groups, of which the Israelites would have been just one. Meanwhile, the Philistines would have been one of the many Sea Peoples who we refer to them as Sea Peoples today, and they would have been coming into Egypt, Canaan, but they would not have been the only ones. But for the biblical text purpose of the Bible, they were the most important ones from the biblical worldview, but they weren't the only ones by any means.
Materially, but there are also other groups there, and there's no question that there was a lot going on.
Okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, we are here in biblical Gat of the Philistines.
Yeah, their word Goliath came from.
Which is kind of about in the middle of all of this, what we would call Philistia. But how many Philistine cities were there? Is Gat here unique amongst them? Is there anything special about it, or is it just that it's been so well excavated?
Okay. Well, first of all, the Bible tells us of 5 major Philistine cities, the so-called Philistine Pentapolis, the 5 cities.
Yeah, I'm going to skip that a little. Let's skip ahead a little bit.
Affiliated with the Philistines because it wasn't, the finds are not clear-cut enough.
Yeah. Okay. Speaking of the finds, what do we have here at Gat that really jumps out as this is Philistine?
Okay. So one of the interesting issues with Telesafi as Gat of the Philistines is that the name does not retain any remnant of the name Gat. Yeah. So that's why, and there isn't any other site in this region that retains the name. So that's why so many sites over the years were identified as Gat. And once we started the excavations, we could show that, as for example, Anson Rainey, the late Anson Rainey, argued that when you analyze the text, this is the place that makes most sense. When we started excavating here, we found everything we should have if this is Philistine Gat, and we didn't find everything we shouldn't find if this was Philistine Gat. And the best example is that we have.
Yeah, so like a lot of the stuff. There's a lot of dispute about which places are exactly what places in the Bible, especially when there isn't like a long history of continuity like in Jerusalem. That being said, most places, even from have their old Canaan names, such as like there was a place called Bith Dagon, which was House of Dagon, even in Israelite times.
A very impressive presence of the Philistines from the very beginning of the Iron Age 1, somewhere around 1200, until the late 9th century, when the site is besieged and destroyed completely by Hazael, the king of Aram Damascus, an event mentioned in 2 Kings 12:18 in the Masoretic text, and after that, the site is not a Philistine city anymore. And this fits in with the textual references to God that after the conquest by Hazael, it doesn't figure into the picture. So, for example, when in the late 7th century, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian, captures the other Philistine cities, God is not in the picture anymore, and so this fits in very well with a very large and dominant Philistine site with all what we expect to have of a Philistine city. Comes the 9th century, let's say 830 destruction. It's not there anymore, and that fits in very well with what we know from the textual sources on the Philistine god.
Okay. Now let's, if you don't mind, can we dig in a little bit more onto the archaeology of God specifically? So I know that you guys have found a lot of really cool things here. Obviously, been digging for a long time, including you found walls,
Yeah. That's just an interesting view of the whole place. Literally, just amazing view.
on huge parts of the domestic quarter of the city, and you found temples and cultic areas. So
That's significant because Philistine temples are described in the Bible, notably like with the story of Samson.
I'm curious, looking at especially like the cultic stuff, what do we learn about Philistine once again culture religiously that kind of sets it apart?
First of all, just for a sort of the topography,
Yeah, like, for example, did they worship Mediterranean gods? Did they worship Canaanite gods? Was there some sort of mixture? Were they kind of their own thing?
we're now standing in the lower city.
Yep.
And above us is the upper city. The upper city was settled in almost all periods when Tel Safi was settled, and only in the Iron Age, in the Philistine city, this large, flat, lower city was settled. And one of the advantages to that is that after the destruction by Hazael, this area was never resettled. So the Iron Age lower city is right at surface. So now, in our excavations, as you said, we found all kinds of things: domestic areas, production areas, fortifications, temples, etc. And we have so far found 3 cultic buildings. Let's call them temples for the sake of. One was on the eastern side of the Upper Tel. One is right behind over there in the lower city, Area D. And another one was found off-site to the east of the site. And each one is different. They're all from the
Different how, I wonder?
Iron 1 to the Iron 2A, the destruction by Hazael, and they're very different in character. So, for example, the one on the Tel is a small little building with 2 pillars, like the story of
We got like story of Samson, he's going to say.
Samson knocking the pillars of Gaza. This one over here is a structure you can't see.
Okay, that's interesting. The horn, you could see like the horned altar there, the 2 horns on that altar for incense. I've heard it suggested that they may have learned that from the Israelites and their Israelite neighbors who put horns in their altars. I've also heard it suggested that the Canaanites, whoever, may have put horns on their altars as well. Just something interesting I thought I'd point out.
Anything of it, it's completely covered over. It's a structure which is actually somewhat similar to an Israelite 4-room house.
Okay.
Interesting. Israelites among the Philistines, or Israelite cultural influence.
It has buildings around it, and it has a large metal production facility right next to it. And it's right next to the gate, which you see over here, down there, one of the gates, probably the water gate.
Okay, that's significant because, like, the gates are where, and that's kind of society where it was kind of like Main Street. It's where the judges were. It's where cultic activity tended to happen. A lot of it's where law courts were. It's where the markets were. It's like Main Street, where the gates of cities were the Main Street.
That leads to the other side. There is a water well. And then the third temple is off-site, and as far as its plan, very poorly preserved, but its plan seems to be reminiscent of a Canaanite-type temple. So even just by the architecture...
I'm wondering if they're kind of worshipping like 3 gods, in a way. Like, an Aegean god up on top of the hill, that's more traditionally Philistine, more Canaanite local gods, and also, like, gotta keep the gods of the enemy happy, because, like, they're the enemy god, but, like... Again, I'm just thinking out loud. Don't take what I say too seriously. I've not fully studied this like I should have, hopefully someday. But just a random thought I'm putting out there.
It's diverse. Now, when we look at for example, the best preserved temple, the temple over here, on the one hand, we have cultic aspects which are very reminiscent of Aegean cultic traditions, both in the objects, and very recently we published the botanical remains from this temple, which show a very interesting culture connection with the Aegean cultic traditions. And for example, we found in the charred botanical remains a whole bunch of chase tree fruits, which is a fruit which is in the Aegean. The largest amount of them are found in the temples in the temple of Hera.
So very Aegean Greek style thing going on.
It might indicate that there is some joint tradition here to the ritual of some goddess. So again, when we look at the temples and the cult, we have some things which are clearly non-local, bringing in new cultic traditions, and some things that are clearly very local.
Now,
this is all pretty interesting. So I won't watch the whole video. You can watch the whole thing on I'll try to remember to link the whole video in the description. But yeah, like, what do you guys think? What do you think about those 3 temples? Were they to different gods? Were they worshipping all Philistine gods? Oh, they're worshipping a mixture of like 3 pantheons. Like, were they worshipping Yahweh? Were they worshipping a Canaanite god and a Philistine god? All at the same time having like a hybrid pantheon? Like, again, there are cultures that do that as well. Think like in Japan, I've heard it said they follow 3 religions. There's these temples that have like both. There's these Buddhist temples that have Shinto gods inside of them, shrines inside as well. And they have these Shinto temples that have like Buddhist shrines in them off to the side. And it's a very interesting mix. So, what do you guys think? So what are your thoughts on the Philistines? Who were they? Where did they come from? What was their culture like? What do you think their worldview would have been? Anyway, God bless. Have a great day. If you ever get a chance to check out an SSPX church, since we're on the topic of temples, take the chance and give it a look. God bless.